The Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, Part 9, starting at letter 25. My dear Wormwood, the real trouble about the set your patient is living in is that it is merely Christian. They all have individual interests, of course, but the bond remains mere Christianity. What we want, if men become Christians at all, is to keep them in the state of mind I call Christianity and. You know Christianity and the crisis, Christianity and the new psychology, Christianity and the new order, Christianity and the faith healing, Christianity and the physical research, Christianity and the vegetarianism, Christianity and the spelling reform. If they must be Christians, let them at least be Christians with a difference. Substitute for the faith itself some fashion with a Christian coloring. Work on the horror of the same old thing. The horror of the same old thing is one of the most valuable passions we have produced in the human heart, an endless source of heresies in religion, folly in counsel, infidelity in marriage, the inconsistency in friendship. The humans live in time, and they experience reality successively. To experience much of it, therefore, they must experience many things. In other words, they must experience change. And since they need change, the enemy, being a hedonist at heart, has made change pleasurable to them, just as he has made eating pleasurable. But since he does not wish them to make change any more than eating, an end in itself, he has balanced the love of change in them by the love of permanence. He has contrived to gratify both tastes together in the very world he has made. By that union of change, and by the permanence which they call rhythm, he gives them the seasons, each season different yet every year the same, so that spring is always felt as a novelty, yet always as a reoccurrence of the immemorial theme. He gives them in his church a spiritual year. They change from the fast to the feast, but it is the same feast as before. Now just as we pick out and exaggerate the pleasure of eating to produce gluttony, so we must pick out this natural pleasantness of change and twist it into a demand for absolute novelty. This demand is entirely our workmanship. If we neglect our duty, men will not be only contented by transported by the mixed novelty and a familiarity of snowdrops this January, sunrise this morning, plum pudding this Christmas. Children, until we have taught them better, will be perfectly happy with a seasonal round of games in which conkers succeed hopscotch, as regularity as autumn follows summer. Only by incessant efforts is the demand for infinite or unchemical change kept up. This demand is valuable in various ways. In the first place, it diminishes pleasures while increasing desire. The pleasure of novelty is by its very nature more subject than any other to the law of diminishing returns, and the continued novelty costs money, so that the desire for it spells avarice or unhappiness or both. And again, the more rapacious this desire, the sooner it must eat up all the innocent sources of pleasure and pass on to those the enemy forbids. Thus, by inflaming the horror of the same old thing, we have recently made the arts, for example, less dangerous to us than perhaps they have ever been. Lowbrow and highbrow artists alike being now drawn daily in the flesh is and still flesh, excesses of lasciviousness, unreason, cruelty, and pride. Finally, the desire of novelty is indispensable if we do not produce fashions or vogues. The use of fashions in thought is to distract the attention of men from their real dangers. We direct the fashionable outcry of each generation against those vices of which it is least in danger, and fix its approval on the virtuous near to that vice which we are trying to make endemic. The game is to have them all running about with fire extinguishers whenever there is a flood, and all crowdinging to that side of the boat which is already nearly gunwale under. Thus we make it fashionable to expose the dangers of enthusiasm at the very moment when they are all really becoming worldly and lukewarm. A century later, when we are really making them all Byronic and drunk with emotion, the fashionable outcry is directed against the dangers of the mere understanding. Cruel ages are put on their guard against sentimentality, fleckless and idle ones against respectability, lecherous ones against puritanism. And whenever all men are really hastening to be slaves or tyrants, we make liberalism the prime boogie. But the greatest triumph of all is to elevate this horror of the same old thing into philosophy, so that nonsense in the intellect may reinforce corruption in the will. It is here that the general evolutionary or historical character of modern European thought, partly our work, comes in so useful. The enemy loves platitudes. Of a proposed course of action, he wants men, so far as I can see, to ask very simple questions. Is it righteous? Is it prudent? Is it possible? Now, if we can keep men asking, is it in accordance with the general movement of our time? Is it progressive? Is it reactionary? Is it the way that history is going? They will neglect the relevant questions, and the questions we do ask are, of course, unanswerable. For they do not know the future, and what the future will be depends very largely on just these choices, which they now invoke the future to help them make. As a result, while their minds are buzzing in this vacuum, we have a better chance to slip in and blend them to the action we have decided on. And great work has already been done. Once they knew that some things were for the better, and others for the worse, and others again indifferent, we have largely removed this knowledge. For the descriptive adjective unchanged has been substituted the emotional adjective stagnant. We have trained them to think that the future as a promised land, which favored heroes attain not as something which everyone reaches at the rate of 60 minutes an hour, whatever he does, whoever he is. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. My dear Wormwood, yes, courtship is the time for sowing those seeds which will grow up 10 years later into domestic hatred. The enhancement of unsatisfied desire produces results which the humans can make to mistake for the results of charity. Avail yourself of the ambiguity in the word love. Let them think they have solved by love problems. They have in fact only waived or postponed under the influence of the enchantment. While it lasts, you have your chance to foment the problems in secret and render them chronic. The grand problem is that the unselfishness, note once again that your admirable work of our philological arm is substituting the negative unselfishness for the enemy's positive charity. Thanks to this, you can, from the very outset, teach a man to surrender benefits, not that others may be happy in having them, but that he may be unselfish in foregoing them. That is a great point gained. Another great help, where the parties concerned are male and female, is the divergence of view about unselfishness which have built up between the sexes. A woman means by unselfishness chiefly taking trouble for others. A man means not giving trouble to others. As a result, a woman who is quite far gone in the enemy's service will make a nuisance of herself on a larger scale than any man, except those whom our Father has dominated completely. And conversely, a man will live long in the enemy's camp before he undertakes as much spontaneous work to please others as a quite ordinary woman may do every day. Thus, while the woman thinks of doing good offices and the man of respecting other people's rights, each sex, without any obvious reason, can and does regard the other as radically selfish. On top of these confusions, you can now introduce a few more. The erotic enchantment produces a mutual complaisance in which each is really pleased to give in to the wishes of the other. They also know that the enemy demands of them a degree of charity which, if attained, will result in similar actions. You must make them establish as a law for their whole married life that degree in mutual self-sacrifice which is at present sprouting naturally out of the enchantments, but which, when their enchantment dies away, they will not have charity enough to enable them to perform. They will not see the trap, since they are under the double blindness of mistaking sexual excitement for charity and of thinking that the excitement will last. When one a sort of official, legal or nominal, unselfishness has been established as a rule for the keeping of which their emotional resources have died away and their spiritual resources have not yet grown. And most delightful results follow. In discussing any joint action, it becomes obligatory that A should argue in favor of B's supposed wishes and against his own, while B does the opposite. It is often impossible to find out either party's real wishes. With luck, they end up doing something that neither wants, while each feels the glow of self-righteousness and harbors a secret claim to parental treatment for the unselfishness shown, and a secret grudge against the other for the ease which the sacrifice has been accepted. Later on, you can venture on what may be called the generous conflict illusion. This game has been played with more than 2 players, in a family with grown-up children, for example. Something quite trivial, like having tea in the garden, is proposed. One member takes care of to make it quite clear, through not so many words, that he would rather not, but is, of course, prepared to do out of unselfishness. The others instantly withdraw their proposal, obstinately through their unselfishness, but really because they don't want to be used as a sort of lay figure on which the first speaker practices petty altruisms. But he is not going to be done out by his debauch of unselfishness either. He insists on doing what the others want. They insist on doing what he wants. Passions are aroused. Soon saying is saying, "Very well then, I won't have any tea at all," and a real quarrel ensues, but bitter resentment on all sides. You see how it's all done? If each side had been frankly contending for his own real wish, they would have kept within the bounds of reason and courtesy. But just because the contention is reversed and each side is fighting the other side's battle, all the bitterness which really flows from thwarted self-righteousness and obscenity and the accumulated grudges of the last 10 years is concealed from them by the nominal or official unselfishness of what the other is doing, or at least held to be excused by it. Each side is, indeed, quite alive to the cheap quality of the adversary's unselfishness and to the false position into which he is trying to force them, but each manages to feel blameless and ill-used itself with no more dishonesty than becomes natural to the human. A sensible human once said, "If people knew how much ill-fitting unselfishness occasions, it would not be so often recommended from the pulpit." And again, she's the sort of woman who lives for others. You can always tell the others by their haunted expression. All this can be begun even in a period of courtship. A little real selfishness on your patient's part is often of less value in the long run, but securing his soul than the first beginnings of that elaborate and self-conscious unselfishness, which may be one day blossom into the sort of thing I have described. Some degree of mutual falseness, some surprise that the girl does not always notice just how unselfish he is being, can be smugged in already. Cherish these things, and above all, don't let the young fools notice them. If they notice them, they will be on the road to discovering that love is not enough, that charity is needed and not yet achieved, and that no external law can supply its place. I wish Screwtape could do something about undermining that woman's sense of ridiculousness. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. My dear Wormwood, you seem to be doing very little good at present. The use of his love to distract his mind from the enemy is, of course, obvious, but you reveal what poor use you are making of it when you say that the whole question of distraction and the wandering mind has now become one of your chief subjects of his prayers. That means you have largely failed. When this or any other distraction crosses his mind, you ought to encourage him to thrust it away by sheer willpower and to try to continue the normal prayer as if nothing has happened. Once he accepts the distraction as his present problem and lays that before the enemy, it makes it the main theme of his prayers and his endeavors, then, so far from doing good, you have done harm. Anything, even a sin, which has a total effect of moving him up close to the enemy, makes against us in the long run. A promising line is the following. Now that he is in love, a new idea of earthly happiness has arisen in his mind, and hence a new urgency in his purely petitionary prayers about this war and other such matters. Now is the time for raising intellectual difficulties about prayer of that sort. False spirituality is always to be encouraged on the seemingly pious ground that praise and communion with God is the true power. Humans can often be lured into direct disobedience to the enemy, who is his mutual, flat, commonplace, uninteresting way, has definitely told them to pray for their daily bread and the recovery of their sick. You will, of course, conceal from him the fact that the prayer for daily bread, interpreted in a spiritual sense, is really just as crudely petitionary as it is in any other sense. But since your patient has contracted the terrible habit of obedience, he will probably continue such crude prayers whatever you do. But you can worry him with the haunting suspicion that the practice is absurd and can have no objective result. Don't forget the use the heads of wins, tails you lose argument. It is the thing he prays for doesn't happen, then that is one more proof that precautionary prayers don't work. If it does happen, he will, of course, be able to see some of the physical causes which led up to it, and therefore it would have happened anyway, and thus a granted prayer becomes just as good a proof as a denied one that prayers are ineffective. You, being a spirit, will find it difficult to understand how he gets into this confusion, but you must remember that he takes time for the ultimate reality. He supposes that the enemy, like himself, sees some things as present, remembers often others as past, and anticipates others as future. Or even if he believes that the enemy does not see things that way, yet in his heart of hearts he regards this as a particularity of the enemy's mode of perception. He doesn't really think, though he would say he did, that enemy things as the enemy sees them are things as they were. If you try to explain to him that men's prayers today are one of the innumerable coordinates with which the enemy harmonizes the weather of tomorrow, he would reply that then the enemy always knew men were going to make those prayers, and if so, they did not pray freely, but were predestined to do so. And he would add that the weather on a given day can be traced back through its causes to the original creation of matter itself, so that the whole thing, both on the human and on the material side, is given from the word go. What he ought to say, of course, is obvious to us, that the problem of adjusting the particular weather to the particular prayers is merely the appearance at 2 points in his temporal mode of perception of the total problem of adapting the whole spiritual universe to the whole corporeal universe. That creation in its entirety operates on every point of space and time, or rather that their kind of consciousness forces them to encounter the whole self-consistent creative act as a series of successive events. Why that the creative act leaves room for their free will is the problem of problems. The secret behind the enemy's nonsense about love, how it does so, is no problem at all. For the enemy does not foresee the humans making their free contributions in the future, but sees them doing so in his unabound now. The obviously to watch a man doing something is to not make him do it. It may be replied that some meddlesome human writers, notably Bothemius, has let this secret out, but in the intellectual climate which he had at last succeeded in producing throughout Western Europe, you needn't bothered by that. Only the learned read old books, and we have now so dealt with the learned that they are of all men the least likely to acquire wisdom by doing so. We have done this by inarticulating the historical point of view. The historical point of view, put briefly, means that when the learned man is presented with any statement in an ancient author, the one question he never asks is whether it is true. He asks who influenced the ancient writer and how far the statement is consistent with that he said in other books, and what phrase in the writer's development or in the general history of thought it illustrates, and how it affected later writers, and how often it has been misunderstood, specifically by the learned man's own colleagues, and what the general course of criticism on it has been for the last 10 years, and what it is the present state of the question. To regard the ancient writer as a possible source of knowledge, to anticipate that what he said could possibly modify your thoughts on your behavior, this would have been rejected as immutable simple-minded. And since we cannot deceive the whole human race all the time, it is most important thus to cut every generation off from all others. For where learning makes a free commerce between the ages, there is always the danger that the characteristic errors of one may be corrected by the characteristic truths of another. But thanks to be our Father and the historical point of view, great scholars are now as little nourished by the past as the most ignorant mechanic who holds the history in his bunk. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape.